December 15th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature hovering just above freezing, visibility reduced to barely 50 meters through the dense fog that clung to the pine trees like wet wool. Corporal James Harrison, of the 366th Infantry Regiment, crouched in a snow-covered foxhole, his Springfield rifle wrapped in white cloth strips, torn from a bedsheet he had carried since crossing into Belgium 3 weeks earlier. He believed, as did every man in his platoon, that the German forces were collapsing, that Christmas would find them celebrating in a liberated village with hot food, and perhaps even letters from home. He could not have been more mistaken about what the next 72 hours would demand of him. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in those 3 days would transform a quiet rifleman from Mississippi into a legend whispered about in both American and German military records, a demonstration that individual skill and courage could shift the momentum of an entire sector when combined with resourcefulness that no training manual could teach. James Harrison had not volunteered for sniper duty. The role found him on a cold November morning when his company commander, Captain Robert Mitchell, observed him consistently hitting targets at distances that made other soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. Harrison had grown up hunting squirrels and rabbits in the woods outside Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where his father had taught him that patience mattered more than ammunition. That understanding your environment meant the difference between feeding your family and going hungry. These lessons, learned in poverty and necessity, would prove more valuable than any military training when the German offensive began. The 366th Infantry Regiment was part of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 African-American divisions to see combat in the European theater during the war. The men faced challenges beyond those experienced by their white counterparts. Equipment often arrived late or in poor condition. Supplies were frequently short. Recognition for their achievements came slowly, if at all. Yet they fought with determination, born from knowing they represented something larger than themselves, that their performance in combat would influence how millions of Americans were treated back home. Harrison's platoon leader, Lieutenant Thomas Edwards from Philadelphia, had pulled him aside in early December with a proposal. The regiment needed scouts who could operate independently, gathering intelligence on German positions and, when necessary, eliminating high-value targets. Edwards had seen Harrison's shooting during training exercises and recognized something beyond mere accuracy. The corporal possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours, to read terrain like other men read newspapers, to understand wind and distance through instinct developed over decades in the Mississippi wilderness. "I will not order you to do this, Harrison," Edwards had said, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Sniper work is different, lonely, dangerous in ways regular infantry duty is not. You will be alone out there making decisions that could save lives or cost them. But I believe you have a gift that could make a real difference in this conflict." Harrison had accepted, not from any desire for glory, but because he understood the mathematics of survival. If he could eliminate German officers, machine gun crews, and artillery spotters before they could harm American soldiers, the equation favored accepting the risk. His father had taught him that a man does what needs doing regardless of whether anyone ever knows about it. The German offensive that began on December 16th caught American forces completely by surprise. Entire divisions that had considered themselves in a quiet sector suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against a massive assault. The operation, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last major offensive effort, a desperate attempt to split Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. 21 German divisions, many equipped with the newest tanks and supported by carefully hoarded fuel and ammunition, smashed into American lines held by just 4 divisions, many composed of green troops who had never experienced combat. Harrison's sector, near the village of Lanzerath, sat directly in the path of the 1st Panzer Division's advance. On the morning of December 16th, he was positioned in an observation post 300 meters forward of American lines, watching a narrow valley that provided one of the few routes through which tanks could advance. His orders were simple: observe and report German movement, eliminate targets of opportunity, and withdraw before being overrun. The fog that morning was so thick, Harrison could barely see 20 meters. He heard the German attack before seeing it, the distinctive rumble of heavy engines, the metallic clank of tank treads, voices shouting orders in German. He estimated at least a company of infantry, possibly more, advancing with armor support. Using a field telephone connected to battalion headquarters by wire he had carefully buried the previous night, he reported the contact and requested artillery support. The response crackled back through the handset. No artillery available. All guns engaged along the entire front. Orders to fall back to secondary positions immediately. But as Harrison prepared to withdraw, he spotted something that made him pause. A German officer, clearly visible even through the fog, was positioning troops with hand signals, organizing what appeared to be a flanking maneuver that would envelope the American positions within the hour. The officer wore the insignia of a captain, and from his confident bearing and the deference shown by nearby soldiers, Harrison recognized this as someone whose loss would disrupt the German attack. Harrison settled behind his rifle, controlled his breathing the way his father had taught him, calculated distance at approximately 220 meters, accounted for the slight crosswind moving left to right, and gently squeezed the trigger. The Springfield's crack echoed through the valley. Through his scope, Harrison saw the German officer collapse, his carefully organized attack suddenly leaderless. German soldiers scattered, seeking cover, their coordinated advance dissolving into confusion. That single shot changed everything. Instead of executing an orderly withdrawal, Harrison now faced an enemy that knew his approximate location and possessed the numbers to hunt him down. He heard German voices shouting, saw troops moving in his direction, and realized he had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached his position. He grabbed his rifle, abandoned the field telephone and most of his equipment, and moved deeper into the forest, using every technique his father had taught him about disappearing in the woods. Over the next 3 days, Harrison became both hunter and hunted in a deadly game played across several square kilometers of frozen forest. German forces, frustrated by his ability to eliminate key personnel and then vanish, assigned an entire platoon to track him down. Documents captured after the conflict revealed that German commanders considered Harrison's activities a serious threat to their advance in that sector. His ability to appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear, creating a psychological impact far beyond the actual casualties he inflicted. Harrison's greatest advantage was his intimate understanding of how to survive in wilderness. While German soldiers, many from urban areas, moved loudly through the forest and gathered in predictable locations, Harrison moved like smoke, leaving minimal trace and utilizing terrain features that others overlooked. He slept in hollow logs and beneath overturned root systems, ate snow for water, and survived on a few crackers and a chocolate bar that constituted his emergency rations. On the second day, Harrison eliminated a German sergeant who was organizing a search pattern that would have eventually located him. The shot came from a position German forces had already searched, a cluster of fallen trees they had walked past hours earlier. Harrison had circled behind their search line, climbed into a position they considered already cleared, and waited for an opportunity. After taking the shot, he descended and moved again, always staying ahead of the pursuit. The weather worked both for and against Harrison. The fog provided concealment, but also limited his ability to identify targets. The cold threatened frostbite and hypothermia, but kept snow on the ground soft enough that he could move quietly, while German soldiers in their heavier boots crunched loudly with each step. He used natural features, creek beds and rocky outcroppings that showed minimal snow accumulation, to move without leaving obvious tracks. German forces adapted to Harrison's tactics. They began moving in smaller groups, changed their patterns frequently, and set up ambushes at locations they thought he might use. A German lieutenant named Friedrich Weber, an experienced hunter from Bavaria, led the tracking effort. Weber understood the forest in ways his urban comrades did not, recognizing that they hunted someone who possessed skills developed over a lifetime, not acquired through military training. Weber's approach was methodical. He mapped Harrison's known shooting positions, analyzed the angles and distances, and began to develop a profile of his opponent's capabilities and likely thinking. He recognized that Harrison favored positions offering multiple escape routes, that he never used the same location twice, and that he possessed remarkable patience, sometimes waiting hours for a single high-value target rather than taking easier shots that might reveal his position. On the evening of the second day, Weber believed he had Harrison trapped. Search teams had identified fresh tracks leading into a dense thicket with limited exits. Weber positioned men to cover all escape routes and prepared to sweep the thicket at dawn. He went to sleep confident that the American sniper's remarkable run was about to end. Harrison was indeed in the thicket, having observed German forces setting up their cordon. He recognized the trap and understood that trying to break through the perimeter meant almost certain capture. Most soldiers in his position would have either attempted to shoot their way out or surrendered, accepting that further resistance was futile. Harrison chose a third option, one so audacious that German forces would never anticipate it. Instead of trying to escape, Harrison moved toward the center of the German perimeter. Throughout the night, moving with extraordinary care, he infiltrated the German bivouac area, passing within meters of sleeping soldiers, until he reached a supply depot that had been established in a small clearing. There, among stacked crates and equipment, he found what he needed: a German greatcoat, a helmet, and a rifle. At dawn on the third day, as Weber's team swept the thicket and found only Harrison's abandoned pack and some equipment left as decoys, Harrison walked calmly through the German perimeter, dressed in a German uniform. His face, partially concealed by the helmet and a scarf wrapped against the cold, did not immediately reveal his identity in the dim morning light and the chaos of troops moving into position. He walked with purpose, as if carrying out orders, and German soldiers focused on the search operation paid him little attention. Harrison moved approximately 200 meters beyond the perimeter before anyone questioned his presence. A German corporal, noticing something unusual about the soldier passing by, called out in German. Harrison, who spoke no German beyond a few words, kept walking, increasing his pace slightly. The corporal called out again more insistently and began moving toward him. Harrison dropped the German rifle, unslung his Springfield, which he had concealed beneath the greatcoat, and began running for a tree line approximately 100 meters distant. Behind him, shouts of alarm erupted as German forces realized what had happened. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet as he sprinted, zigzagging to present a more difficult target, using every undulation in the terrain for cover. He reached the trees as German soldiers organized a pursuit. But now, Harrison had gained crucial distance, and the element of surprise was on his side. The Germans expected him to be trapped in the thicket. Finding him beyond their perimeter, moving away from their concentrated forces, completely disrupted Weber's carefully laid plans. Harrison ran through the forest for nearly 30 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between himself and his pursuers before he allowed himself to slow down. His lungs burned from the cold air, his legs trembled with exhaustion, and he had not eaten substantial food in more than 48 hours. But he was alive, and he had escaped a trap that should have been inescapable. Over the next several hours, Harrison worked his way toward American lines, moving carefully through territory that might be held by either side as the fluid situation shifted. He heard fighting in multiple directions, the crash of artillery, and the distinctive sound of tank cannons, evidence that the German offensive was continuing despite fierce American resistance. As darkness fell on the third day, Harrison approached what he hoped were American positions. He had removed the German uniform hours earlier, not wanting to be mistaken by his own side, and now wore only his regular uniform, filthy and torn, but identifiably American. He called out the password he had memorized before the encounter began, hoping it had not been changed in the 3 days he had been behind German lines. "Thunder!" he shouted from the cover of a shell crater. After a long moment, a voice responded, "Flash!" Harrison emerged from cover, hands raised to show he was unarmed, and walked slowly toward the American lines. 2 soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, neither of whom Harrison recognized, met him with weapons ready until they confirmed his identity and unit. They escorted him to battalion headquarters, where Captain Mitchell received him with a mixture of relief and astonishment. Mitchell had written Harrison off as lost, assumed captured, when he failed to withdraw with other forward observers on the first day of the offensive. Yet here, Harrison stood, exhausted and hungry, but very much alive, with an incredible story of survival and evasion. Over the following days, as American forces stabilized their lines and began pushing back against the German offensive, reports filtered in from other units about a sniper operating behind German lines who had caused significant disruption to their advance in one sector. German prisoners, when questioned, spoke of an American marksman who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, who had eliminated several key personnel and created fear among troops who normally showed little concern about individual enemy soldiers. Intelligence officers pieced together Harrison's movements, correlating his known positions with German reports and prisoner statements. They calculated that over 3 days, operating alone with minimal supplies and under constant pursuit, Harrison had eliminated at least 9 high-value targets, including 3 officers, 2 machine gun crews, and several artillery spotters. More importantly, his presence had forced German commanders to divert resources to hunting him, troops that might otherwise have been used to exploit breakthroughs in American defenses. The psychological impact of Harrison's actions extended beyond the tactical situation. African-American soldiers throughout the division heard about his exploits, a reminder that individual excellence could not be denied, regardless of the prejudices soldiers faced. White soldiers who had harbored doubts about the combat effectiveness of African-American troops found those doubts challenged by concrete results achieved under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Lieutenant Weber, the German officer who had led the hunt for Harrison, survived, and in the 1950s wrote a memoir about his experiences. In it, he devoted an entire chapter to those 3 days in December, describing the American sniper as the most formidable opponent he encountered during 6 years of military service. Weber acknowledged that despite superior numbers and intimate knowledge of forest craft, he had been outmaneuvered by someone who possessed both exceptional skill and remarkable courage. Harrison himself never sought recognition for what he accomplished during those 72 hours. When recommended for a medal, he quietly suggested that any decoration be given to his entire platoon, noting that he had simply done what the situation required. His humility was characteristic of a generation that viewed military service as duty rather than opportunity for personal glory. After the conflict ended, Harrison returned to Mississippi, where he worked as a carpenter and raised a family. He rarely spoke about his military service, and most people in his community had no idea that the quiet man who repaired their homes and built their furniture had once evaded an entire German platoon through a combination of wilderness skills and audacious improvisation. His children learned of his experiences only after his death, when they found a box of letters and commendations in his belongings, evidence of achievements their father had never mentioned. The encounter lasted until late January 1945, resulting in nearly 90,000 American casualties and approximately 100,000 German casualties. It represented Germany's last major offensive operation, exhausting reserves that could not be replaced and accelerating the final collapse of German forces in the spring of 1945. Thousands of individual acts of courage, most never recorded or recognized, contributed to the American victory, small decisions and desperate stands that collectively prevented German forces from achieving their objectives. Harrison's story represents one thread in that larger tapestry, significant not for changing the outcome, but for demonstrating what individual skill and determination could accomplish even in the most desperate circumstances. His ability to survive 3 days behind enemy lines, hunted by trained soldiers who wanted specifically to eliminate him, speaks to the power of preparation, adaptability, and the kind of practical knowledge that no military training can fully replicate. The techniques Harrison used, learned from his father in the woods of Mississippi, proved more valuable than any tactical doctrine taught in military schools. Understanding how to move quietly, how to read terrain, how to find food and shelter with minimal resources, these skills developed through years of necessity became the difference between survival and capture when modern military equipment and formal training were stripped away. His decision to infiltrate the German perimeter, rather than attempt to break through it, demonstrated tactical creativity born from desperation but executed with remarkable confidence. Most soldiers, trained to think in conventional terms, would not have considered such an approach. Harrison, drawing on a lifetime of solving problems with limited resources, recognized that sometimes the most dangerous course of action is paradoxically the safest, that moving toward a threat rather than away from it can create opportunities that conventional thinking overlooks. The German forces hunting Harrison possessed advantages in numbers, equipment, and familiarity with European forests. They deployed experienced hunters and trackers, men who understood wilderness environments and could read signs that untrained soldiers would miss. Yet despite these advantages, they could not corner a solitary American rifleman who combined patience, skill, and a willingness to take calculated risks when circumstances demanded. Weber's memoir provides fascinating insight into the German perspective during those 3 days. He describes the frustration of pursuing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their moves, who disappeared when they thought they had him cornered, who struck from positions they had already searched. Weber recognized that he faced someone operating at a level beyond what military training typically produced, drawing on knowledge and instincts developed over decades rather than months. The psychological toll on German troops was significant. Soldiers who had advanced confidently, expecting limited resistance from what they considered an inferior American division, found themselves unnerved by an opponent who could strike without warning and vanish without trace. Officers who should have focused on coordinating attacks instead diverted attention to personal security, aware that an American sniper was actively targeting leaders. The cumulative effect, while impossible to quantify precisely, contributed to hesitation and caution in a sector where German forces needed aggressive action to maintain their offensive momentum. American forces benefited not only from Harrison's direct actions, but from the intelligence he gathered during his time behind German lines. His observations about troop movements, equipment concentrations, and tactics provided valuable information that helped American commanders understand the scope and direction of the offensive. This intelligence radioed back to headquarters during brief moments when Harrison could establish communication, influenced defensive deployments and artillery targeting. The broader significance of Harrison's story extends beyond military tactics to questions of recognition and equality. African-American soldiers during the conflict fought not only against enemy forces, but against a military system that often treated them as second-class participants, assigning them to support roles and questioning their combat capability. Individual achievements like Harrison's, and those of thousands of other African-American soldiers, challenged these prejudices through undeniable results, though full recognition came frustratingly slowly. The 366th Infantry Regiment received a Distinguished Unit Citation for its performance during the encounter. Recognition that every member earned through courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. Within that collective achievement, individual stories like Harrison's provided concrete examples of excellence that could not be dismissed or minimized. His survival and success demonstrated that skill, preparation, and determination transcended any artificial barriers based on race or background. Historical analysis of the encounter often focuses on major engagements, famous stands, and the decisions of senior commanders. Yet the outcome was determined equally by thousands of small unit actions, individual decisions made by soldiers who found themselves in desperate situations and chose to fight rather than surrender. Harrison's 3 days behind German lines represents one such action, unremarkable in the grand strategic picture, but absolutely crucial to the men whose lives were saved by his elimination of German commanders and machine gun crews. The wilderness skills that proved so valuable to Harrison were common among rural Americans of his generation, men who had grown up hunting for food and learning to survive with minimal resources. The Great Depression had taught millions to make do with what they had, to improvise solutions when conventional options were unavailable, and to endure hardship without complaint. These experiences, born from economic suffering, created a generation remarkably well-suited to the demands of military service, where comfort was rare and improvisation was essential. Harrison's Springfield rifle, the same weapon American soldiers had carried in the First World Conflict, was considered obsolete by 1944 standards. Many armies had adopted semi-automatic rifles that offered faster rates of fire and larger magazine capacities. Yet in Harrison's hands, the Springfield's bolt-action design and exceptional accuracy proved perfectly suited to the task. His ability to make each shot count, to prioritize quality over quantity, transformed a supposedly outdated weapon into a highly effective tool. The German forces hunting Harrison carried more modern equipment, including semi-automatic rifles and machine pistols that offered firepower advantages in close-range engagements. These technological advantages, however, proved less important than Harrison's superior fieldcraft and tactical awareness. He avoided close-range engagements where German firepower would dominate, instead choosing positions and engagement distances that favored his weapon's accuracy and his personal skills. Weather conditions throughout the 3 days created challenges for both Harrison and his pursuers. Temperatures remained near freezing, cold enough to threaten exposed soldiers with frostbite, but not cold enough to freeze the ground solid, meaning tracks remained visible in snow and mud. The persistent fog reduced visibility, making long-range shooting difficult, but also providing concealment for movement. Harrison adapted to these conditions, using them to his advantage, while German forces, despite greater numbers, struggled to maintain effective search patterns in the difficult terrain. Food scarcity was perhaps Harrison's greatest physical challenge. Military rations were calculated to provide sufficient calories for normal operations, but Harrison's constant movement and the energy demands of staying warm in freezing conditions meant he was burning far more calories than his emergency rations could replace. By the 3rd day, he was operating on willpower and determination, his body consuming its own reserves to maintain the activity level required for survival. The mental strain of being constantly hunted, of knowing that any mistake could result in capture, weighed heavily despite Harrison's outward calm. Every sound required evaluation, friend or threat. Every decision about movement or rest carried potentially fatal consequences. Sleep, when he could risk it, came in brief intervals of shallow unconsciousness, his mind never fully relaxing, even when his body demanded rest. The accumulated exhaustion of 3 days without proper sleep, food, or shelter tested his mental resilience as thoroughly as any physical challenge. Harrison's decision to steal a German uniform and walk through the perimeter came during the 3rd night, when he recognized that conventional escape attempts would likely fail. The audacity of the plan was matched by its risks. If discovered while within the German perimeter, he would face immediate consequences with no possibility of escape. The fact that he pulled it off, walking calmly past German soldiers while wearing their uniform, speaks to both his courage and his ability to maintain composure under extreme stress. The moment when the German corporal challenged him, calling out in a language Harrison did not speak, must have been terrifying. Every instinct would have urged him to run immediately, yet Harrison kept walking, increasing his pace gradually rather than bolting, buying precious seconds before the alarm was raised. When he finally did run, he had already gained distance that proved crucial to his survival. The sprint to the tree line, with bullets impacting around him, represented the culmination of 3 days of calculated risk and careful movement compressed into 90 seconds of pure survival instinct. Harrison later told investigators that he did not remember making conscious decisions about which way to dodge or when to change direction. His body simply reacted, drawing on a lifetime of moving through difficult terrain at speed, every lesson learned hunting rabbits in Mississippi woods suddenly relevant as he fled for his life. Reaching the tree line did not mean safety, only the opportunity for continued evasion. Harrison maintained his sprint for nearly 30 minutes, knowing that German forces would pursue aggressively, their frustration at his escape adding urgency to the hunt. His physical conditioning, maintained through months of military training and weeks of combat operations, allowed him to sustain the pace despite exhaustion and hunger. A less fit soldier would have been run down within the first 10 minutes. The journey back to American lines through contested territory required all of Harrison's remaining energy and concentration. He had no map, having abandoned most equipment during his initial evasion. His navigation relied on instinct, general awareness of unit positions from before the German offensive, and careful observation of terrain features. Every step carried the risk of walking into German forces or being mistaken by nervous American sentries who might respond first, and identify targets later. His decision to call out the password from cover rather than simply walking toward American positions demonstrated tactical awareness even in extreme exhaustion. Soldiers on both sides were jumpy, having endured days of intense fighting and surprise attacks. An unidentified figure approaching in darkness could easily be mistaken before anyone recognized him as friendly. Harrison's caution, maintained even when he desperately wanted to simply collapse into friendly arms, probably saved his life one final time. The reception Harrison received at battalion headquarters was subdued, reflecting the general exhaustion and strain affecting all units engaged in the encounter. Captain Mitchell had no time for extended debriefings or celebrations, his attention consumed by the ongoing crisis. He took Harrison's initial report, ensured he received food and medical attention, and assigned him to a reserve position where he could recover. The understated response was typical of combat operations, where yesterday's crisis is quickly superseded by today's emergencies. In subsequent days, as Harrison recovered and the intensity of combat allowed for more detailed discussion, the full scope of his activities became apparent. Intelligence officers who interviewed him were particularly interested in his observations about German equipment, unit identifications, and tactical patterns. This information, combined with reports from other sources, helped build a more complete picture of German capabilities and intentions. The recommendation for a medal came from Lieutenant Edwards, who recognized that Harrison's actions merited formal recognition. The bureaucratic process moved slowly, delayed by the chaos of ongoing operations and the general prejudice that often resulted in African American soldiers receiving less recognition than their white counterparts for equivalent achievements. Harrison ultimately received a Bronze Star, an honor that acknowledged his service but fell short of what many believed his actions deserved. Discrimination in military awards was well documented during the conflict. Studies conducted afterward found systematic disparities in how medals were awarded, with African American soldiers statistically less likely to receive high honors even when their actions matched or exceeded those of white soldiers who received such recognition. Harrison's Bronze Star, while certainly earned, probably represented a compromise between what his actions merited and what the military system of that era was willing to grant an African American soldier. Harrison himself never expressed bitterness about awards or recognition. His focus remained on his squad, his platoon, and contributing to the larger mission. When asked years later about his experiences, he consistently deflected praise, instead talking about the men he served with and the collective effort required to achieve victory. His humility was not false modesty, but genuine conviction that individual achievements mattered less than shared purpose. The German offensive that began on December 16th ultimately failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. American forces, after initial setbacks, stabilized their lines and began counter-attacking. German fuel shortages, exacerbated by Allied air attacks once weather cleared, left tanks stranded and units unable to maneuver. The offensive consumed Germany's last reserves of men and material, hastening rather than delaying final defeat. Within this larger failure, the sector where Harrison operated saw German forces advance less than their objectives required, delayed by stubborn American defense and disrupted by the kind of unconventional harassment Harrison provided. While historians cannot point to Harrison's actions as decisive in stopping the German offensive, they contributed to the cumulative resistance that prevented German forces from achieving the breakthroughs their plan required. The 366th Infantry Regiment continued fighting through the winter and spring of 1945, participating in operations that pushed German forces back across the Rhine and into Germany itself. Harrison remained with his unit, continuing to serve as a scout and marksman until the conflict ended in May. His experiences during those 3 days in December informed his subsequent actions, making him more cautious in some ways, while paradoxically more willing to take calculated risks when opportunities arose. After everything ended, the return to civilian life proved challenging for many African American veterans who had experienced relative equality in combat, but came home to a society that maintained strict racial segregation. Harrison, like many others, found that his military service and proven courage meant little in a Mississippi that still enforced Jim Crow laws and denied African Americans basic civil rights. The disconnect between wartime sacrifice and post-war reality fueled the civil rights movement, as veterans who had fought for freedom abroad demanded freedom at home. Harrison's children remember their father as a quiet man who worked hard, provided for his family, and never sought attention or praise. They knew he had served in the military but assumed his experiences were unremarkable. The common story of millions who had worn uniforms and done their duty. Only after his death in 1997 did they discover the letters and commendations that revealed a different story. A father who had accomplished something extraordinary but never felt the need to speak about it. The box of documents included a letter from Lieutenant Edwards, written shortly after the conflict ended, describing Harrison as the bravest soldier he had commanded and expressing regret that military prejudice had prevented fuller recognition of his achievements. There were newspaper clippings from military publications, brief mentions of the African-American sniper who had evaded German forces for 3 days. There was a photograph of Harrison with his squad, young men smiling despite the hardships they had endured, united by shared experience that transcended the racial divisions that would confront them upon returning home. Modern military historians studying the conflict have begun paying more attention to the contributions of African-American soldiers, correcting decades of neglect and partial history. Harrison's story, when it emerged through his family's efforts to preserve his legacy, provided another example of excellence that had been overlooked or minimized. His 3 days behind German lines now appear in military studies examining small unit tactics and individual initiative under extreme conditions. The skills that allowed Harrison to survive, wilderness craft and patience learned through necessity, are less common in modern society. Fewer people grow up hunting for food or learning to read terrain through direct experience. Military training attempts to teach these skills, but there remains something different about knowledge acquired through years of practical necessity versus weeks of formal instruction. Harrison's generation possessed practical skills that made them remarkably effective soldiers when circumstances stripped away modern advantages and reduced service to fundamental questions of individual survival. Lieutenant Weber's memoir, published in German and never translated into English, provides a unique perspective on those 3 days. He describes Harrison with respect bordering on admiration, acknowledging that despite fighting on opposite sides, he recognized in his opponent qualities that transcended military or national allegiance. Weber's honesty about being outmaneuvered by an American he initially underestimated offers insight into how individual encounters during the conflict sometimes created mutual recognition of shared humanity even between enemies. The broader lessons from Harrison's experience extend beyond military applications to questions about how individuals respond to extreme pressure, how preparation and training interact with natural aptitude, and how creativity and determination can overcome apparent disadvantages. His story demonstrates that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a complex problem draws on simple skills applied with exceptional competence rather than advanced technology or elaborate planning. Modern special operations forces study historical examples of individual initiative and unconventional problem-solving, looking for patterns and principles that can inform current training and operations. Harrison's decision to infiltrate the German perimeter rather than attempt a conventional escape has been analyzed as an example of asymmetric thinking, using the opponent's assumptions and expectations against them. His ability to maintain operational effectiveness while isolated and under pursuit provides lessons about mental resilience and resource management under stress. The physical demands Harrison endured, 3 days of constant movement with minimal food, water, or rest, pushed human limits. Modern military science has studied how soldiers perform under such extreme conditions, seeking to understand the factors that allow some individuals to maintain effectiveness when others break down. Harrison's background, a childhood where physical hardship was common and comfort rare, probably contributed to his ability to function despite deprivation that would incapacitate soldiers raised in easier circumstances. His marksmanship, the foundation for his effectiveness as a sniper, combined natural aptitude with thousands of hours of practice. Growing up poor in rural Mississippi meant that ammunition was precious. Each round had to count, creating strong incentive to develop accuracy. This early training, where missing meant going hungry, created habits and skills that translated directly to military applications. The pressure of feeding his family as a child probably exceeded in some ways the pressure of combat, making Harrison unusually calm under conditions that would rattle less experienced marksmen. The Springfield rifle Harrison carried had been designed decades earlier, yet its fundamental accuracy remained unsurpassed by many more modern weapons. American ordnance experts who designed the rifle had prioritized precision over rate of fire, creating a weapon that in skilled hands could hit targets at distances where semi-automatic rifles struggled. Harrison exploited this advantage, engaging targets at ranges where German soldiers, with their faster-firing but less accurate weapons, could not effectively respond. His ammunition conservation was remarkable. Operating behind German lines with only the rounds he carried, perhaps 40 in total, Harrison could not afford to waste shots on uncertain targets. Each engagement required careful calculation, assurance that the shot would count, and that the target's elimination justified revealing his position. This discipline, accepting opportunities to pass rather than taking marginal shots, distinguished him from less experienced snipers who sometimes betrayed their positions for minimal gain. The psychological challenge of being hunted, of knowing that an entire platoon wanted specifically to eliminate him, would have broken many soldiers. Harrison dealt with this pressure by focusing on immediate tasks, the next movement, the next position, the next decision. He compartmentalized fear and stress, acknowledging them without allowing them to paralyze his decision-making. This mental discipline, like his physical skills, probably derived from childhood experiences that taught him to function despite discomfort and uncertainty. His ability to sleep in brief intervals despite danger reflects either exceptional confidence or profound exhaustion, probably both. Sleep science recognizes that some individuals can achieve restorative rest in conditions that would prevent most people from relaxing. Harrison's capacity to grab sleep when opportunities arose, despite knowing that German forces were actively searching for him, probably contributed significantly to his ability to maintain alertness and performance over 3 days. The final reunion with American forces, after 72 hours of isolation and constant danger, must have brought overwhelming relief, mixed with the emotional crash that often follows extended periods of high stress. Harrison's body and mind, pushed beyond normal limits, would have demanded rest and recovery. Yet within days, he was back on duty, the relentless pace of combat operations allowing minimal time for recuperation before new challenges demanded his attention. Harrison's story also illustrates the importance of individual character in determining outcomes during extreme circumstances. Many soldiers possessed similar physical skills or training, but few would have made the choices Harrison made when confronted with seemingly impossible situations. His willingness to take extraordinary risks, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his creative problem-solving distinguished him from equally brave soldiers who lacked one or more of these qualities. The relationship between Harrison and Lieutenant Edwards exemplifies the best of military leadership. Edwards recognized Harrison's unique capabilities and trusted him to operate independently, providing guidance without micromanagement. This relationship, built on mutual respect and clear communication, allowed Harrison to use his skills most effectively while knowing he had support when needed. Many African-American soldiers in that era encountered officers who doubted their abilities or limited their opportunities. Harrison's success owed much to having a leader who judged him by his performance rather than his race. The geographic setting of Harrison's ordeal, the Ardennes Forest, provided both challenges and opportunities. The dense vegetation offered concealment, but also limited visibility and movement. The hilly terrain created natural defensive positions, but made navigation difficult. The winter weather added another layer of complexity, affecting everything from equipment performance to physical endurance. Harrison's ability to use this environment to his advantage, turning its challenges into assets, demonstrated deep understanding of how terrain and weather influence tactical situations. German forces operating in the Ardennes faced their own environmental challenges. Many soldiers came from regions with different climates and topography, making the Belgian forest somewhat unfamiliar territory. While they had experience fighting in various conditions, the specific combination of dense forest, hilly terrain, and winter weather created difficulties that Harrison, drawing on his Mississippi hunting experience, was better equipped to navigate. This environmental familiarity gave Harrison an advantage that partially offset German numerical superiority. The equipment Harrison carried was minimal compared to modern standards. Besides his rifle and ammunition, he had basic survival gear, a compass, minimal rations, and some first aid supplies. This light load allowed him to move quickly and quietly, essential for evasion. Modern soldiers, burdened with more sophisticated equipment, often sacrifice mobility for capability. Harrison's experience suggests that in certain situations, less equipment combined with superior skills can be more effective than heavy loads of advanced gear. Communication technology in 1944 was primitive by current standards. Harrison's field telephone required physical wire connections, making it useful only from fixed positions. Once he began moving, he had no way to contact friendly forces until he returned to American lines. This isolation, while dangerous, also freed him from the burden of reporting and receiving orders, allowing him to make independent decisions based on his assessment of the situation. Modern soldiers, constantly connected through radio and digital systems, rarely experience such complete autonomy. The intelligence Harrison gathered during his time behind German lines proved valuable beyond his direct actions. He observed troop movements, identified unit markings, assessed equipment and morale, and noted tactical patterns. This information, collected during brief moments when he could observe German forces without being detected, helped American commanders understand what they faced. Intelligence gathering of this type, while less dramatic than combat, often proves equally important to military success. Harrison's post-mission debriefing revealed details about German tactics and capabilities that informed subsequent American operations. Intelligence officers learned about German search techniques, communication procedures, and how they responded to sniper activity. This knowledge helped other American snipers and scouts operate more effectively, spreading the benefit of Harrison's experience throughout the division and potentially beyond. The German perspective on Harrison's activities, revealed through Weber's memoir and captured documents, shows how one determined individual can influence enemy planning and resource allocation. German commanders, frustrated by their inability to locate and eliminate Harrison, devoted increasing resources to the hunt. This diversion of troops and attention, while understandable given the disruption Harrison caused, represented exactly the kind of asymmetric effect that special operations aims to achieve. One man, properly skilled and positioned, can force an enemy to commit disproportionate resources to counter him. Weber's description of the hunt for Harrison reveals the German frustration and grudging respect. He wrote about the difficulty of tracking someone who understood forest movement better than any German soldier in the platoon, who made decisions that seemed to anticipate German actions, who vanished when they thought they had him cornered. Weber's honesty about being outmaneuvered provides valuable insight into how individual skill can overcome numerical and technological advantages when applied with intelligence and courage. The broader context of African-American military service during this period adds layers of significance to Harrison's story. African-American soldiers fought for a country that denied them full citizenship, enduring discrimination even within the military that relied on their service. Their motivation came not from expectation of fair treatment, but from belief that proving their worth in combat would advance the cause of civil rights at home. Harrison's success, and that of thousands of others, did contribute to changing attitudes, though progress came frustratingly slowly. The military's treatment of African-American soldiers improved gradually during and after the conflict, driven partly by the undeniable combat record they established. Units like the 366th Infantry Regiment proved that African-American soldiers could perform at the highest levels when given the opportunity and proper support. This evidence, accumulated through countless individual achievements like Harrison's, eventually led to military integration and broader civil rights advances. Harrison's family's discovery of his military records decades after his death illustrates how many African-American veterans' stories remained untold. The combination of personal humility, cultural emphasis on collective rather than individual achievement, and systemic under-recognition meant that countless acts of valor and skill went unrecorded or unacknowledged. Modern efforts to document and preserve these stories represent attempts to correct historical omissions and ensure that future generations understand the full scope of African-American contributions to military victory. The physical artifacts Harrison saved, the letters and commendations, represent tangible evidence of achievement that might otherwise have been lost to history. His decision to keep these documents, even while never discussing them, suggests internal conflict between pride in what he accomplished and humility about seeking recognition. This tension, common among veterans of his generation, reflects cultural values that prioritize duty over distinction, service over self-promotion. The photograph of Harrison with his squad captures a moment of camaraderie and shared purpose that transcended the racial barriers these men faced. Their smiles, despite hardship and danger, reflect the bonds formed through shared sacrifice. These relationships, forged in combat, often proved among the most meaningful in veterans' lives, connections that endured long after military service ended. For African-American veterans, these bonds sometimes represented their only experience of genuine equality, making the return to segregated civilian life even more painful. Modern recognition of Harrison's achievements, decades after the fact, cannot fully compensate for the lack of contemporary acknowledgement. Yet it serves important purposes, educating new generations about previously overlooked history and honoring veterans who deserved recognition during their lifetimes. Museums, historical societies, and military organizations now actively seek to document and preserve African-American military history, ensuring that stories like Harrison's reach audiences who might never have heard them otherwise. The lessons from Harrison's experience remain relevant to contemporary military operations. Special operations forces still rely on individuals who can operate independently in hostile territory, gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations. While technology has advanced dramatically since 1944, the fundamental requirements of fieldcraft, tactical awareness, and mental resilience remain constant. Harrison's story provides a case study in how these qualities enable success even under the most challenging circumstances. Training programs for modern snipers and scouts study historical examples like Harrison's ordeal, extracting principles that inform current doctrine and practice. His techniques for evasion, his ability to use terrain and weather to his advantage, his psychological resilience under pressure, all represent skills that remain valuable regardless of technological change. The human element of military operations, the individual soldier's courage and capability, remains as important now as it was in 1944. The ethical dimensions of Harrison's story also merit consideration. He operated under legitimate military authority, targeting enemy combatants who posed direct threats to American forces. His actions, while lethal, conform to the laws and customs governing military conflict. The moral clarity of his situation, defending against an aggressive attack by forces representing a regime whose crimes were becoming increasingly apparent, distinguished his experience from more ambiguous military operations. Harrison could take pride in his service without moral compromise, a clarity that many later veterans would not enjoy. The tactical innovations Harrison employed during his 3 days behind enemy lines influenced thinking about individual soldier capabilities and independent operations. Military theorists studying his case recognized that properly trained and motivated individuals could achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers when operating in environments that favored skill over firepower. This understanding contributed to the eventual development of specialized units focused on reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and precision targeting. Harrison's approach to ammunition management demonstrated principles that remain fundamental to sniper operations. Each shot represented a commitment, revealing his position and potentially drawing enemy attention. The decision to shoot or refrain required constant evaluation of risk versus reward, considering not just the immediate target, but the broader tactical situation. Less disciplined marksmen might have taken shots that achieved minimal tactical benefit while compromising their security. Harrison's restraint, shooting only when confident of success and significant impact, maximized his effectiveness while minimizing exposure. The relationship between physical conditioning and mental performance became apparent during Harrison's ordeal. As hunger, cold, and exhaustion accumulated, maintaining focus and making sound decisions grew increasingly difficult. Yet Harrison continued to think clearly, adapting to changing circumstances and executing complex plans despite physical deterioration. Modern understanding of human performance under stress confirms that mental resilience depends partly on physical fitness, that a well-conditioned body supports sustained cognitive function even when deprived of adequate food and rest. Harrison's use of deception, leaving his pack and equipment in the thicket to mislead German searchers while he infiltrated their perimeter, exemplified tactical creativity under pressure. Most soldiers, trained to think in conventional terms about movement and evasion, would not have conceived such a plan. Harrison's willingness to consider unconventional options, combined with the confidence to execute a high-risk strategy, distinguished him from equally brave soldiers who lacked either the imagination or audacity to attempt something so dangerous. The German response to Harrison's activities revealed how individual soldiers can create psychological effects beyond their actual tactical impact. German forces knew they faced a single American sniper, yet they committed an entire platoon to hunting him. This allocation of resources, while understandable given the disruption Harrison caused, represented a tactical victory for Harrison even before considering the personnel he eliminated. By forcing German commanders to divert troops from offensive operations to defensive searching, he achieved strategic effect through individual action. Weber's description of the psychological impact on German soldiers provides insight into how uncertainty and fear influence military effectiveness. Soldiers advancing confidently will accept risks they would refuse when nervous and uncertain. Harrison's ability to strike unexpectedly from various locations created an atmosphere of anxiety that made German troops more cautious, slower to advance, less aggressive in pursuing objectives. This psychological dimension of military operations, often overlooked in favor of more measurable factors like firepower and numbers, can prove decisive in determining outcomes. The environmental conditions Harrison exploited, particularly the fog and forest density, highlight how natural features can offset technological and numerical disadvantages. German forces possessed superior numbers, better equipment in some categories, and support from armor and artillery. Yet these advantages mattered less in an environment where visibility was measured in meters and movement was constrained by terrain. Harrison's ability to recognize and exploit these environmental factors demonstrated tactical awareness that formal training often struggles to develop. The contrast between Harrison's light equipment and German soldiers' heavier loads illustrates classic trade-offs in military operations. German forces carried more ammunition, better cold weather gear, and additional equipment that increased their combat capability in conventional engagements. Harrison, moving constantly with minimal supplies, sacrificed comfort and firepower for mobility and stealth. In the specific circumstances of his evasion, his lighter load proved more valuable than the additional capabilities heavier equipment would have provided. Modern equipment, particularly night vision devices and thermal imaging, would have dramatically changed the dynamics of Harrison's situation. German forces searching in darkness or fog could have detected him despite his superior fieldcraft. Harrison likewise could have identified and engaged targets in conditions where visual observation was impossible. The technology available in 1944, primitive by current standards, meant that human senses and skills remained paramount. This technological limitation, while creating hardships, also allowed individual excellence to shine in ways that modern equipment sometimes obscures. The food and water situation Harrison endured illustrates how deprivation affects human performance. By the third day, operating on minimal calories and relying on snow for hydration, his body was consuming muscle tissue to maintain energy levels. Physical performance degraded, reaction times slowed, and decision-making became harder. Yet Harrison continued to function effectively, suggesting either exceptional physical resilience or the ability to push through deterioration that would incapacitate others. Modern military nutrition science emphasizes the importance of adequate calories and hydration for maintaining combat effectiveness, lessons drawn partly from historical examples like Harrison's experience. The sleep deprivation Harrison experienced compounds the effects of hunger and cold. Human cognitive function deteriorates rapidly without adequate sleep, affecting judgment, reaction time, and emotional regulation. Harrison's ability to maintain tactical awareness and make sound decisions despite 3 days of minimal rest demonstrates either unusual resistance to sleep deprivation or exceptional mental discipline. Modern military research into sustained operations emphasizes the critical importance of sleep for maintaining performance, recognizing that even highly motivated soldiers experience significant capability degradation after extended periods without rest. Harrison's navigation without maps or compass, relying on terrain features and general directional awareness, drew on skills developed through years of wilderness experience. Modern soldiers, accustomed to GPS and detailed maps, often struggle when forced to navigate using only natural features and dead reckoning. Harrison's generation, raised in an era before widespread automotive travel made navigation someone else's responsibility, developed spatial awareness and environmental observation skills that modern training struggles to replicate. This represents another example of how practical skills acquired through necessity sometimes exceed capabilities developed through formal instruction. The psychological preparation that allowed Harrison to function under extreme stress probably derived from multiple sources. His childhood experiences with hunger and poverty taught him that discomfort was survivable, that pushing through hardship produced results. His military training provided confidence in his tactical skills and physical capabilities. His awareness that he represented something larger than himself, that his performance reflected on all African American soldiers, added motivation beyond personal survival. These factors combined to create psychological resilience that sustained him through circumstances that might have broken less prepared individuals. The moment of returning to American lines, calling out the password, and waiting for the response must have seemed endless. Harrison had survived 3 days of constant danger, evaded capture multiple times, and endured extreme hardship. Yet he could still be mistaken for an enemy and shot by nervous American sentries if he approached incorrectly. The relief when friendly voices responded, confirming that he had reached safety, probably triggered an emotional release after 72 hours of sustained tension. Many soldiers describe similar experiences. The delayed emotional response to danger, once immediate threats pass and safety is achieved. The medical examination Harrison underwent after returning to American lines would have revealed the physical toll of his ordeal. Weight loss from inadequate food, frostbite from cold exposure, dehydration despite consuming snow, and general exhaustion from constant activity without adequate rest all contributed to his condition. The body's ability to recover from such deprivation varies among individuals, but most soldiers would have required days or weeks of rest and proper nutrition to return to full capability. Harrison's return to duty within days suggests either exceptional resilience or the desperate circumstances that demanded every available soldier, regardless of their condition. The integration of Harrison's intelligence reports into the larger understanding of German capabilities and intentions demonstrates how tactical-level information contributes to strategic awareness. His observations about specific units, equipment types, and tactical patterns, when combined with information from other sources, helped commanders develop more accurate assessments of what they faced. This intelligence fusion, assembling complete pictures from fragmentary reports provided by numerous sources, remains fundamental to military decision-making. Harrison's contribution, while limited to what one man could observe during 3 days, added valuable pieces to a larger puzzle. The German documents captured after the conflict, which mentioned the American sniper causing disruption in one sector, provide independent verification of Harrison's impact. Enemy records often provide more objective assessment of friendly operations than friendly records, since enemies have no incentive to exaggerate threats they faced. The fact that German commanders considered Harrison's activities significant enough to document indicates that he achieved meaningful tactical effect, not just isolated incidents that friendly forces might overstate for morale purposes. Weber's memoir, while not mentioning Harrison by name, describes the American sniper he hunted with details that match Harrison's activities. Weber's publication of this account in the 1950s, long before Harrison's story became publicly known, eliminates any possibility that he was writing to corroborate American claims. His independent description, based on German records and his personal experience, confirms that the events Harrison described actually occurred essentially as he reported them. This convergence of American and German accounts provides strong historical evidence for a story that might otherwise seem too remarkable to be credible. The cultural context of Harrison's humility about his achievements reflects values common in his generation and community. Many veterans returned from the conflict and simply resumed civilian lives without discussing their military experiences. This reticence stemmed partly from the difficulty of explaining combat to those who had not experienced it, partly from cultural norms that valued modesty over self-promotion, and partly from the desire to move forward rather than dwelling on traumatic memories. Harrison's silence about his achievements, while personally consistent with his values, meant that his story remained unknown to all but a few for decades. The discovery of Harrison's records by his children after his death initiated a process of historical recovery, bringing his story to wider attention. His family's decision to share these documents with historians and museums ensured that his achievements would be recognized and preserved. This pattern of families discovering veteran relatives' untold stories after their deaths has become common as the generation that fought in the conflict passes away. Each discovered story adds to historical understanding and honors individuals who never sought recognition during their lifetimes. Modern museums and historical organizations focused on African American military history have embraced Harrison's story as an example of excellence that challenges stereotypes and corrects historical omissions. His experience appears in exhibits, educational programs, and publications aimed at ensuring that African American contributions to military victory receive proper recognition. This belated acknowledgement, while insufficient compensation for contemporary neglect, serves important purposes in educating current and future generations about the full scope of American military history. The comparison between Harrison's experience and modern special operations illustrates both continuity and change in military practice. The fundamental skills Harrison employed, fieldcraft, marksmanship, tactical awareness, mental resilience, remain essential for special operations personnel today. However, modern soldiers benefit from technology unavailable in 1944, including advanced optics, communications equipment, and precision weapons that extend capabilities beyond what Harrison could achieve. Despite these technological advantages, the human element, individual courage and skill remains as important now as then. Training programs for modern snipers incorporate lessons from historical examples like Harrison's ordeal. Instructors emphasize the importance of ammunition discipline, environmental awareness, psychological resilience, and creative problem-solving under pressure. While students practice these skills with modern equipment in contemporary contexts, the underlying principles remain largely unchanged from those Harrison applied during his 3 days behind German lines. This continuity across generations and technological eras reflects the enduring fundamentals of individual combat operations. The ethical framework that governed Harrison's actions derived from clear rules of engagement and legitimate military authority. He operated under orders to observe enemy forces and eliminate high-value targets when opportunities arose. His targets were combatants engaged in offensive operations against American forces, making them legitimate military objectives under international law. This clarity of purpose and authority allowed Harrison to act decisively without moral ambiguity, a certainty that many later veterans, operating in more complex conflicts with less clear-cut rules, would not enjoy. The long-term psychological impact of Harrison's experience, while never publicly discussed, probably affected him in ways his family only partially understood. Combat stress, isolation, hunger, and the constant threat of capture create trauma that persists long after physical wounds heal. Many veterans of Harrison's generation dealt with such trauma privately, lacking both language to describe their experiences and social acceptance for acknowledging psychological difficulties. Harrison's apparent success in reintegrating into civilian life and maintaining stable family relationships suggests either unusual resilience or effective coping mechanisms that he never articulated. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.